So today we're diving into some pretty weighty stuff, huh? You sent over this transcript from 57 VIO, and it's basically a YouTube broadcast featuring Lai Ching-te.
Yeah, definitely a big one, especially with all the tension surrounding the Taiwan Strait these days.
Absolutely. And what really struck me right off the bat was the way Lai Ching-te comes out swinging, framing China's influence and actions not just as like political differences, but as real threats to Taiwan's sovereignty and its whole democratic system.
Oh, yeah, no doubt. He's not mincing words. It's almost like he's drawing a line in the sand right from the start.
Exactly. So what we want to do today is really unpack all of this, break down his statements, and delve into those specific examples he uses to kind of paint this picture of what he sees as the major challenges facing Taiwan. We want to make sure you, the listener, really get the full picture here.
Yeah, it's about going beyond the surface level, right? Like, what specific activities are raising red flags for him, and what kind of strategies does he think are needed to counter them? That's the real meat of this.
Right. So let's start with one of his first points, the whole free speech debate, which he brought up in response to a pretty specific situation, actually.
Right. He was talking about the case of a Chinese spouse who's facing deportation because of some comments they made online, uh, seemingly advocating for, unification with the mainland, but by force.
Yeah. And his response was pretty blunt, wasn't it? He basically said, advocating for war, hatred, and violent crimes, those aren't protected under free speech.
Mm.
It's not just about expressing an opinion. These are actions that could directly hurt Taiwan and its people. And he even went so far as to mention the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights.
Exactly. And that's a really key point. He's grounding his argument, his understanding of free speech in international law. This isn't just some personal opinion or political rhetoric. He's connecting it to a globally recognized legal framework, which I think speaks volumes about his approach to these issues. And just for our listener, that agreement basically sets out fundamental human rights, including the right to free speech. But what Lai Ching-te is pointing out is that even within those rights, there are limits, especially when speech directly incites violence or threatens national security.
Makes sense. Now, he also touched on the whole issue of Taiwanese artists working in China, didn't he?
Hmm.
He seemed to recognize the kind of pressures they face over there, career-wise and all, but also made it clear that he hopes they still act in a way that respects Taiwan's interests and, the feelings of the people here.
Yeah, it's a really tricky situation, right? You've got artistic expression on the one hand, but then also economic realities and national identity all mixed in. It's a tough balancing act. He's essentially asking these artists, these public figures, to really think about the potential impact of their words and actions, given their platform and influence.
Right, right. Okay, so let's move on to what I think is the core of his address, the whole issue of Chinese influence and interference.
Yeah.
He lays out a whole bunch of concerns here that clearly have him worried.
Yeah, and he starts by talking about, concerns that a lot of everyday Taiwanese citizens have been voicing. Things like retired military personnel allegedly being recruited by China, for intelligence gathering, and even, which is even scarier, the possibility of them being involved in setting up armed groups inside Taiwan.
That's a pretty serious accusation, right?
Yeah.
Former military folks being turned and potentially becoming a threat from within. And then he went on to talk about cultural workers, people in the arts and media, allegedly cooperating with Beijing to undermine Taiwan's standing as an independent nation.
Yeah, and when you look at influence operations more broadly, these are pretty textbook tactics. The aim is often to use people within a society to subtly shift public opinion, chip away at those core beliefs about national identity and independence. And culture, it's a powerful tool for that because it can really shape how people think and feel over time.
Absolutely. He also brought up the whole rapid-fire spread of messages coming from Chinese state media, stuff specifically meant to stir up trouble and create divisions within Taiwanese society. And he even talked about people allegedly helping Chinese state media produce programs promoting unification, pushing this idea that democracy doesn't work, that the U.S. should just pack up and leave the region, basically poking at all the existing sore spots.
Yeah, it paints a pretty clear picture of a strategic, multi-pronged approach. Different messages tailored to different groups, all aimed at creating chaos and undermining national unity. And the thing is, with digital media these days, the speed and reach of all this is just amplified, making it even more potent. What's important to understand here is that they're not creating these divisions out of thin air. They're exploiting pre-existing societal fault lines, amplifying them to weaken national cohesion. It's straight out of the information warfare playbook.
Exactly. And then he brings up the work of this strategic scholar, Jiswane K, who has this whole framework for understanding China's tactics, this kind of five-pronged approach.
Hmm.
Subversion, infiltration, media acquisition, psychological warfare, legal warfare, all basically aimed at dividing and conquering.
Right, and this framework provides a really useful lens for looking at all these different allegations, doesn't it? It suggests a well-planned, comprehensive strategy, not just random, isolated incidents. It's all connected.
Absolutely. Then Lai Ching-te doubles down on his belief that China's ultimate goal, annexing Taiwan, eliminating the Republic of China, that hasn't changed. No matter what they say or how they act in the short term, that core objective remains the same.
Yeah, and that really highlights how he sees these threats, not as temporary bumps in the road, but as manifestations of a long-term strategy. It shapes his whole interpretation of what's going on.
And to back that up, he points to some specific legal moves, most notably the 2005 anti-secession law and the more recent one from June 2023, the Punishment for Taiwan Independence Separatist Forces thing, which has like 22 articles in it.
Yeah, basically laying down the law, at least from their perspective. These documents, they provide the legal basis for their claims over Taiwan and spell out the potential consequences for anyone advocating for independence. He's basically saying, look, this is in black and white, this is what they're planning.
Right, right. And he goes on to say that China is basically exploiting Taiwan's freedoms, its open society, to carry out all this infiltration and subversion. He mentions organized crime, media, commentators, political parties, even retired military and police being involved.
That's a huge claim. He's saying there are elements within Taiwan itself that are being used to advance Beijing's agenda, whether they realize it or not. And the idea of former security personnel being involved, that's especially sensitive given their background and knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
He even throws in some hard numbers, citing a statistic from the National Security Bureau. A threefold increase in people indicted for alleged Chinese espionage in 2024 compared to 2021. 64 cases in total.
Wow. That's a big jump. And of course, an indictment isn't a conviction, but it definitely suggests that they're seeing a rise in this kind of activity. It puts some concrete numbers behind those broader concerns he's talking about.
He even named specific organizations like the Unification Promotion Party, the Mutual Assistance and Health Alliance Party, and the Taiwan People's Government as allegedly developing pro-China, potentially armed groups.
These are groups that have openly expressed support for closer ties with the mainland, and he's basically calling them out, highlighting the security risks he sees with their activities, especially that whole potential armed groups thing.
Then he gets into the really sensitive topic of alleged infiltration within the Taiwanese military itself. He cites figures for active and retired military personnel caught up in these alleged espionage cases over the past year, 15 and 28 respectively, which makes up about 6% of all the espionage cases.
Yeah, even a small number within the military can do a lot of damage. The trust and integrity of the armed forces, that's crucial. So those figures, while they might seem small overall, they probably set off a lot of alarm bells within the government.
For sure. Another interesting point he makes is about China's use of, well, all sorts of identification documents, passports, residence permits, ID cards, to kind of muddy the waters around Taiwanese national identity.
Right. It's all about that psychological dimension of influence, isn't it? Blurring the lines, making those distinctions less clear, that can gradually undermine a sense of, separateness, of belonging.
Absolutely. He also claims that China sees any kind of cross-strait exchange, cultural visits, academic stuff, as opportunities for united front work. The goal, according to him, is to sow discord, weaken Taiwanese identity, even create this illusion of Chinese governance in Taiwan.
Yeah, this really shows how skeptical he is of these exchanges. He's not seeing them as just opportunities for people to understand each other better, but as potential tools for manipulation, for advancing Beijing's agenda. And just for our listener, United Front work basically refers to a strategy used by the Chinese Communist Party to rally different groups and individuals toward their goals, which in this case is seen as, well, undermining Taiwan's separate identity.
Right. And to wrap up this whole section on the perceived threats, he talks about China's integrated development strategy, which he claims is designed to pressure Taiwanese businesses to invest in China, recruit Taiwanese youth, acquire key technologies, basically impacting Taiwan's economic security and creating vulnerabilities, especially for younger generations.
This is about the economic side of the threat, right? He's saying that economic interdependence is being weaponized, used to exert political pressure, and potentially cripple Taiwan economically in the long run.
Exactly. And based on all of this, he comes right out and says that China fits the definition of a hostile extraterritorial force under Taiwan's anti-infiltration law. That's a pretty strong statement.
It is, and it really sets the tone for his administration's stance towards Beijing and provides a legal justification for the countermeasures he then lays out. This law is specifically designed to counter the kinds of activities he's talking about, giving them the legal tools to investigate and prosecute foreign interference.
Which brings us to point number 3. Taiwan's proposed response strategies. He frames this as a plan with 5 national security and hidden threats and 17 countermeasures. So let's start with the first threat, the perceived threat to Taiwan's sovereignty.
Here, he reiterates Taiwan's position that sovereignty is non-negotiable. It's the foundation of their existence as a nation. And he emphasizes that there's widespread agreement within Taiwanese society to defend their democracy and resist any attempts at annexation.
He also mentions this 4 Pillars of Peace action plan, although he doesn't get into specifics in this transcript. He just highlights the need to work with allied nations to send a clear message that Taiwan is absolutely opposed to any Chinese takeover.
So international support and collaboration, that's clearly key in their strategy to deter Beijing and solidify their position on the world stage. And the 4 pillars, just to give some background for our listener, that generally refers to strengthening Taiwan's defenses, boosting their economic resilience, building partnerships with other democratic countries, and maintaining stable, principled leadership in dealing with the mainland.
Makes sense. The second threat he focuses on is that infiltration and espionage within the military that we talked about earlier. He proposes a bunch of measures to address this.
Yeah, and a key one is reestablishing a military justice system to handle criminal cases within the armed forces. He specifically mentions offenses like betrayal, leaking secrets, dereliction of duty, insubordination, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and he talks about having military judges back on the front lines, working with judicial authorities.
Yeah.
He also mentioned some complementary reforms, like updated personnel regulations for military judges, organizational laws for military courts and prosecutors. Sounds pretty comprehensive.
It does, and the aim here seems to be about boosting accountability and discipline within the ranks. They recognize that military offenses are different, they have a unique impact on national security, and they need a system specifically designed to deal with them. He also stresses the importance of having the public's trust and support for this system to work effectively.
Yeah, definitely. He also proposes tougher penalties in the criminal code of the armed forces for things like expressing loyalty to the enemy and revising regulations on retirement benefits to deter people from going down that path.
Those are some serious consequences. It's about raising the stakes for anyone within the military who might be tempted to betray their country. Losing those retirement benefits, that's a huge financial hit, a strong deterrent.
Definitely a strong message. So moving on to threat number 3, China's efforts to, well, he says, confuse national identity. He has a couple of strategies in response to that as well.
Yeah, the first one is about tightening up the review process for identification documents. They want to pay closer attention to Taiwanese citizens who apply for Chinese identification, especially those in sensitive positions like the military, government, and education.
Right. The goal being to stop China's integrated development efforts from, I guess, chipping away at the sense of national identity, especially among those who hold positions of responsibility and owe a duty of loyalty to Taiwan.
Exactly. The second strategy deals with Chinese and Hong Kong Macau residents who want to settle in Taiwan. For mainland Chinese, he reiterates the current rule that they have to renounce their original citizenship. And for those from Hong Kong and Macau, he floats the idea of potentially adding longer residency requirements, again with national security in mind.
Got it. The fourth threat he lists is United Front infiltration through cross-strait exchanges, and he has a whole slew of countermeasures for this one.
Yeah, which really underlines how concerned they are about these interactions. He starts by talking about the growing risks of traveling to China, even citing a pretty alarming statistic. 71 reported cases of Taiwanese citizens going missing or being detained there just in early 2024.
Yikes. And he calls for greater public awareness of these dangers, obviously, and for stronger registration systems for Taiwanese traveling to the mainland.
Yeah, all about mitigating those risks. He then goes on to talk about putting in place a disclosure system for individuals and organizations involved in exchanges with China, government employees, elected officials, public interest groups, even religious organizations. The idea is to have more transparency and accountability in these interactions.
Makes sense. And for people from mainland China visiting Taiwan, he proposes a whole risk management approach. He talks about reciprocity, maintaining dignity, considering the overall cross-strait relations, strict limits on anyone with a United Front background, and banning activities deemed to be United Front in nature while in Taiwan.
It definitely sounds like a more cautious, selective approach to who they allow in. National security is clearly the top priority.
Absolutely. He also emphasizes the importance of keeping things depoliticized,
Yeah.
reducing the risk when it comes to exchanges in areas like religion, culture, academia, education. The goal is to keep those interactions as purely civilian and non-political as possible.
Right, trying to preserve the potential benefits of those exchanges, like cultural understanding and academic collaboration, but without opening the door to political manipulation or harmful narratives.
Exactly. And to counter what he sees as China's cultural united front tactics, he talks about boosting Taiwan's own cultural industries, supporting local filmmakers and creative folks, promoting research into Taiwan's history and culture, and providing more guidance and oversight for Taiwanese artists working in China, especially regarding their public statements.
It's all about building up Taiwan's own cultural strength, its own narrative. That focus on supporting local creative industries and historical research, that's key to fostering a distinct Taiwanese identity.
For sure. He also talks about taking measures to prevent cognitive warfare and security threats coming from China through things like online apps and AI. He recognizes that these influence operations, they're evolving, they're happening in the digital space now.
Yeah, cybersecurity, countering disinformation, it's all part of national security these days. It's about adapting to the new landscape of threats and vulnerabilities.
Right, right. And the last point he makes under this whole countermeasures section is that they're planning to review existing administrative orders and potentially amend some of their national security laws, like the National Security Act, the Anti-Infiltration Act, and other relevant legislation, basically shoring up their legal framework for dealing with these threats.
This suggests a commitment to updating and expanding their legal toolkit, making sure they have what they need to address these challenges in a comprehensive way.
Okay, so the fifth and final threat he outlines is China's strategy of attracting Taiwanese businesses and youth through these integrated development initiatives. What's the proposed response to that?
Well, he proposes a strategic overhaul of their economic and trade relationship with China. The idea is to put Taiwan first and focus on diversifying globally, reducing their dependence on the Chinese market.
Right, all about building a stronger, more independent economic foundation. He also mentions strengthening risk management protocols for the flow of people, goods, capital, technology across the strait.
Exactly. They want to protect themselves from potential economic pressure from the mainland.
Makes sense. And he also talks about beefing up education for young people and scholars, educating them about China's intentions and the complexities of cross-strait relations, and at the same time, promoting opportunities for employment and entrepreneurship within Taiwan itself.
Yeah, it's about countering the brain drain, making sure young Taiwanese see a future for themselves at home, not just across the strait.
Absolutely. Okay, so the fourth point we wanted to cover is Lai Ching-te's call to action, his closing remarks. He references the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II, saying that in the end, authoritarian aggression doesn't win.
Powerful analogy, right. He's drawing a parallel with history, finding hope in the fact that authoritarianism has been defeated before. It's a way of framing the current challenges within a broader historical context of resistance.
Definitely. And he hammers home the need for national unity in facing these threats. He even calls on the public to take specific actions, like improving their media literacy, participating in civic education activities, reporting any pro-unification behaviors they see, refusing to take part in activities that could harm Taiwan's interests.
So it's not just about the government taking action. He's saying that everyone has a role to play in protecting Taiwan's security.
Exactly. And he wraps it all up by stating that national unity and cooperation are absolutely crucial for Taiwan's future prosperity and security.
A very clear, direct appeal for a collective effort. It's a reminder that national security isn't just the government's responsibility, it's everyone's.
Couldn't agree more. Okay, last thing we wanted to touch on is some of the responses Lai Ching-te gave to media questions. I thought they provided some interesting additional insights into his thinking.
Yeah, like when he was asked again about that potential deportation of the Chinese spouse, he reiterated his stance. Advocating violence against your own country, that's not protected speech. He even brought up international legal standards again to back up his point.
Right. And then he defended the review they're doing of public servants who have PRC identification, emphasizing their duty of loyalty to Taiwan, especially given the serious threats he just outlined.
His reasoning there is based on the idea that if you're serving in a public role, you have a higher obligation to uphold the interests and security of the nation.
Right, right. Then there was the issue of Taiwanese artists and media figures who've expressed pro-China views. He kind of reiterated his call for them to respect Taiwan's interests and the feelings of the people here. He seemed to acknowledge the pressures they face professionally, but also stress their responsibility in public figures.
Yeah, it's a tough spot, isn't it? Trying to balance respect for individual choices with the need to protect national interests.
Absolutely. And when he was asked about the criticism coming from China's Taiwan Affairs Office, he just said that Taiwan's Mainland Affairs Council had already responded and he didn't need to repeat their points. Kind of a, we've already addressed that response.
Yeah, suggests a unified front, a coordinated approach in how the Taiwanese government is responding to those criticism.
Makes sense. And lastly, he explained his use of the term hostile extraterritorial force to describe China, directly referencing the definition in Taiwan's anti-infiltration law. He said it's based on China's actions, on their stated long-term goals towards Taiwan.
It's him laying out the legal justification for his approach, the framework they're using to understand and respond to their relationship with mainland China.
Right, right. Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive into Lai Ching-te's address, what are the big takeaways for you?
Well, what we see here is a very clear, very detailed articulation of the concerns surrounding China's influence on Taiwan. And it's multifaceted, everything from traditional military and intelligence activities to more subtle forms of, cognitive warfare, economic pressure. He's presenting a picture of interconnected threats all working together.
And importantly, he doesn't just lay out the problems, he proposes solutions. Right. A whole range of countermeasures. Legal reforms, stricter regulations on cross-strait exchanges, efforts to boost Taiwanese identity and economic resilience, and a big emphasis on the need for public awareness and participation in protecting national security.
Exactly. A strategic response hitting all those pressure points he's identified. Multi-layered, comprehensive.
So for our listener who, wants to understand these complex issues in a clear and concise way, I think we've done a pretty good job of unpacking Lai Ching-te's arguments and the evidence he presents.
I hope so. Our goal was to really break it down, make it accessible, and give you a better sense of what's happening.
And now, to leave you with something to think about. Given all the different strategies we've talked about, everything from reforming military justice to supporting local culture and regulating cross-strait exchanges, what single action do you think would be the most effective in protecting Taiwan's interests? And what would be the biggest challenges in making that happen? Something to ponder after our discussion today. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.